think you can hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. I guess before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I think that's really important when we actually talk about domestic and family violence. When we look at the rates of violence against women and children in this country, they're very high in regards to women and children generally, but specifically when we look at what has happened to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people through no fault of their own, through the effects of loss of land, colonization, intergenerational trauma, stealing of their children. And sometimes I think it's actually quite interesting that people talk about those things as if they're in, their historic artifacts. I think it's really important to sort of keep in mind that more Aboriginal children are actually coming into care today than was the case when you actually looked at, the so-called stolen generation. So I think that's really important when we actually have a discussion about violence against women and children. And I also want to say, in terms of the implications of my own chosen profession towards that, so I'm a social worker, and I think it's really important for me to acknowledge, the pain and suffering that social workers have done. Probably, I would argue, inadvertently, coming from a place where they thought they were doing the right thing. But I think it's really important that we actually acknowledge that pain and suffering that's happened through social work and many other professions. So thank you for the introduction. So I won't go into sort of my own background. I'd like to introduce one of my honors students. So I've been lucky enough this year to have two honors students work with me. Nina Melander. And I have another student, David Wilkinson, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight. I've asked Nina to come along because she just had a really interesting experience that I think would be interesting for you to hear about, whereby she had her social work placement actually working in Broken Hill. So she actually saw sort of what's happening in terms of providing government support and services to Aboriginal women and children who are escaping domestic violence. So I'm going to talk like a little bit of time, and then I thought if you're interested, we might pull Nina up here, and you can have a chance to hear from her as well. Okay, I created a really beautiful PowerPoint presentation for you, which I can't show you, so I'm sorry about that. So I might actually just sort of start with my topic. Was looking at so I've been asked to talk about the issue of women fleeing domestic violence, and the first thing that I want to do around that is to reframe that. So, and the reason that I want to do that is I think that, the term women fleeing domestic violence raises all sorts of issues and can be quite emotionally charged. And what I mean by that is I think the single biggest question that researchers have grappled with, and that I think the community grapples with, is this question of, well, why don't women leave? And I want to talk more about women journeying away from domestic violence, because I think that opens up a bigger space to talk about the fact that women journey away from domestic violence in a whole lot of ways. And that might not be fleeing. For lots of women in the community, it's actually not safe for them to leave domestic violence. For lots of women in the community, it's not actually possible for them to leave their homes. But I think that what research and practice tells us is that lots of women in myriad ways every day do a lot of stuff to resist domestic violence. And I think sometimes that doesn't sort of get acknowledged, because I think people get really stuck into a kind of women blaming attitude around this and think, well, she should just leave. I should also acknowledge from the beginning that this is a painful topic. This is a really hard thing to actually talk about because it brings up stuff about the things that we hold most dearly. It brings up issues around the people that we probably love the most. It raises all sorts of issues about gender. It raises a lot of issues about how men and women should relate to each other in relationships. It raises issues probably that might even sort of trigger some, uncomfortable memories. But I think it's a really important topic that we discuss openly. And I think it's great that you on a Thursday night actually have devoted time to come and talk about this. So the question about are our government policies working? I love, what's your name?
Beverly.
Beverly just goes, no. And then we can just leave. So I think it's really interesting. We looked earlier in the year, we had Malcolm Turnbull, talking about budget announcements, talking about, $100 million being devoted to, tackle Australia's shame, as it was put. So I think it's only right and fair that we as taxpayers actually look at that and go, well, what is happening? I think I agree with you, though. When we look at the rates and the evidence and the prevalence of domestic violence, when we look at the surveys that have been done around community attitudes around domestic violence, particularly troubling are the surveys that have looked at young people's attitudes towards domestic violence. I think we can only but conclude that we have a long way to go. It's a complex question, though, because when you actually look at services to women and children who experience domestic violence, you're talking about a very complex system, right? You're talking about legislation, you're talking about a complex service system. And I guess when we actually look at the myriad of legislative reforms that have happened, we've had numerous royal commissions, we've had many policy changes. We've had many legislative reviews of various acts. So it's obviously, you could probably say, well, there are some things that are improving. There are some things that kind of remain entrenched, difficult issues. I guess when you actually look at the data and you look at the Human Rights Commission, there is absolutely unequivocal support for the fact that violence against women is one of the most prevalent manifestations of human rights abuses in Australia. And when we look at how common domestic violence is, we have, every couple of years, the Australian Bureau of Statistics does a personal safety study. The last one they reported in 2014 interviewed 17,000 people across Australia, men and women, looking at what were their experiences of violence. They found that they came up with statistics like 1 in 4 Australian women since the age of 15 have experienced physical or sexual abuse by a current or former intimate partner. So that's huge, isn't it, when you think about that, 1 in 4. And when you broaden that out to actually look at including emotional abuse and coercive control, that increases to 1 in 3. When we talk about how that impacts children, that survey reported that over 500,000 children, over 500,000 women had reported that children were present during domestic violence episodes or incidents. And I want to make it really clear that a child doesn't have to sort of like visually witness domestic violence to be impacted by that experience. We've got lots of research now that sort of moves away from describing children as witnesses to domestic violence and talks more about children who experience domestic violence. Some of the research that I did interviewing men who perpetrated domestic violence, they explained to me countless ways that their children had experienced domestic violence. I had a man describe to me how he had physically punched his partner in the face while she was holding on to her baby. So you would say that child was a direct, indirect recipient of violence. There were lots of instances where men talked to me about how, they had a belief that their children hadn't actually visually witnessed violence, but they experienced it the next morning when they sort of got up, tended to mom's injuries, might have had to, call into mom's place of employment and say, mom's not going to be able to come today because she's sick. There's all sorts of ways that children experience domestic violence. When we look at pregnancy, we actually know that this is hard for a lot of people in the community who don't work in this area to wrap their heads around. But when a woman's pregnant, she's at a very high risk period of being murdered, also suffering. So pregnancy is the second leading, domestic violence is the second leading cause of homicide for pregnant women. So you can see that the impacts on children actually begin even before they're born. So I guess I want to, again, sort of on the theme about, are our policies working? I guess the other thing that gets a lot of attention is the number of women who die in the context of domestic violence and children who die in the context of domestic violence. So we have statistics that indicate that almost every week in Australia, one woman is killed by her current or former partner. That this is often after a history of domestic violence, and that these types of homicides account for 1/5 of all homicides. So, and that's probably an underestimate. So if any of you use Facebook? If you did use Facebook, no thank you. No thank you. You can actually have a look at, there is a web page that some very dedicated, clever people at the University of Technology, Sydney, have created called Destroy the Joint. And they count, so they've got a website that's devoted to counting the number of women who die due to violence each year. Already, in September, they have indicated that 32 women have been killed. Last year, we're talking about 73 women. So, do government policies work? I think one way of actually looking at that is to think about, that really hard edge where women die in this context. Another way to think about it is to look at those women who actually survive. What's the impact on their health and well-being? So we've got studies, there's a often quoted study from Victoria. So Vic Health actually looked at what is the burden of the burden of disease on women who survive domestic violence, and found that in the age group of women who are 15 to 44 years of age, domestic violence is the leading cause of death, disability, and other disease. When they actually looked at the leading risk factors that contribute to disease, they actually found that domestic violence is the leading risk factor over and above the other risk factors associated with disease that we often hear more about. So we hear a lot of stuff about obesity. We hear a lot of stuff about drinking. We hear a lot of stuff about smoking. When they actually looked at the global burden of disease, domestic violence came out on top as a risk factor. And of course, that's compounded for particular groups of women. So if you look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, the contribution to the global burden of disease is even higher for them. The impact of domestic violence is higher for those women and for those children. Also, if you looked at women who are culturally and linguistically diverse, if you looked at women who are in prison, so there are particular groups of women who even carry more of the burden of disease. And that's important to sort of keep in mind. I might just skip ahead. So some of the research that that we've actually been sort of looking at is around, so Nina and David, we've been looking at sort of one particular aspect of government policy, and that's homelessness. That's another significant impact of domestic violence. we know that domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children in Australia. So we've been sort of looking at the state government level, what was the impact of one particular policy reform that happened in New South Wales. So that was called the Going Home, Staying Home reform. And that was something that happened in 2014. That was an initiative that was looking at, they sort of brought on the most significant reforms to the homelessness sector that have happened in about the last 30 years in New South Wales. The aims of that reform included trying to simplify access to specialist housing. So this is the sort of government talk that I'm using here. The other goal was to sort of balance the provision of early intervention, crisis, and post-crisis support. The other goal was to centralize the structure of service provision. And so what we have been finding, we've done some research where we've interviewed across 4 different research projects, we've interviewed about 85 different professionals, looking at what's been the impact of some of those, of that reform on specialist women's domestic violence services. Okay, because what basically happened with that reform is it kind of made homelessness services into a kind of generic basket. Okay, so we had women who had worked in refuges before the reform and women who'd worked in refuges after the reform, and they sort of talked about what had been the impact on their practice. And a lot of it really has to do with this kind of impact of neoliberalism, really. So what we had was a lot of workers sort of talking about the fact that they felt that the women's refuge movement had been crushed through government policy. That they felt that they were no longer in a place to be able to provide the kind of relational support that women who were trying to journey away from domestic violence really needed. They talked about how now their practice was very bureaucratized and very corporatized. They really talked about how they spent most of their time now not one-on-one supporting women and children, but at the computer, entering data that really just went, they didn't know where. But it was kind of, it's kind of part of a bigger picture of neoliberalism. So I had a whole bunch of quotes. Would that be of interest? I only have another couple of minutes. I'm going to pick out my... So some of the things that they talked about, and I'll just read you a couple then. So they talked about how the government line in New South Wales is that there are 76 refuges. We've discovered that only 14 of those 76 refuges specialize in taking women escaping domestic violence. So the rest take a combination of homelessness women, and the two groups don't necessarily mix. So they talked a lot about how the fact that, can I just read you one quote, because I think it's useful. So they talked about how, viewing women's experience of domestic violence through the lens of general homelessness services is just completely and utterly inappropriate. That we talk to women, we have an intake service. We now have to follow a set of questions that takes nearly an hour to interview a woman for an intake. Only 3 of those questions relate to domestic violence. They start out with questions about your finances, your rental history. It's all around establishing a sustainability for a tenancy, and it completely ignores a woman's experience of domestic violence and what would be her most important question, and that would be around her safety and her fear of the perpetrator. The questions that we have to ask now on intake are just appalling. They talked about how competitive tendering made them be placed in a situation where they were sort of pitted against other women's refuges, competing for funding. The fact that I'm calling other refuges agencies makes me sick. That language, we don't have a personal relationship with the other supposed domestic violence services that we used to have. Prior to the reforms, we were members of the women's refuge movement. We knew the other 56 refuges in the state that took women, specifically escaping domestic violence. We met as a group. We don't even know where to refer women to anymore. I'll just read one more. And this was around the issue of competition that came out. There's such a sense of competition around funding that the whole network of services that used to be around to support women escaping domestic violence, it's now a closed shop. We don't want to tell you what we're doing, or we don't want to let you know what we're going to do at our service, because there's every chance that at the next round of funding, you might be one of our competitors. Another woman said, competition, that's the biggest thing that's happened since the reforms. It's created that competition because people used to work together before, united to support women. Now it's dog eat dog. One woman said, I wouldn't say this lightly, but I feel that we've been raped by the government. So that's someone who'd spent most of her working life working in domestic violence and rape services. So really, I guess what I got from that research was just this kind of sense from people who worked in the sector that a lot of lip service is being paid to things like interagency collaboration, trauma-informed care. But on the ground, the experience of these workers was that they were becoming more like bureaucrats and spent most of their time on computers collecting data. So I guess that's the main thing I want to report on. I'd like to actually hand over to Nina because she has a really interesting perspective on what's happening in rural and remote communities around services provided to Aboriginal women. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I tend to speak a little bit quietly sometimes, so I just want to check that everyone can hear me. Yes? Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to really acknowledge that I don't speak for Aboriginal women. I can only speak based on my experiences that I had in Broken Hill. So recently I spent 4 months on my final social work placement, primarily based in the Broken Hill Base Hospital Mental Health Inpatient Unit. So while I was there, I also had the opportunity to spend time in Wilcannia, which is a small town of just 600 people with a population of high Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. According to the statistics, it's about 77%. So while I was there, I really had the invaluable opportunity to hear stories from the community members and get a real idea of what was happening for them and how they felt the government was or was not providing them with adequate services. The first thing that I noticed when I got to Broken Hill was that there was only one women's refuge, which, considering that Broken Hill has one of the highest rates of domestic violence in New South Wales, I thought was quite strange.
Oh. Sorry about that.
Further to that,
That's going to make it sound better.
the refuge is commonly known by other community members. In fact, you can Google it if you so please. It's also run by the Salvation Army, who undoubtedly does great work with community members, but also has a strong, religious and ethical values which may not align with all women. Speaking with the domestic violence and sexual assault workers in Broken Hill, one issue that they raised to me was that if a woman gets kicked out of the women's refuge in Broken Hill, there's no other option for them. And considering the extreme geographical location of Broken Hill and the isolation, that's, I think, a pretty problematic issue. So while I was in Wilcannia, I have to say I've never, in my privileged upbringing in the city of Sydney, seen anything or heard any of the stories that I heard in Wilcannia while I was there. So one woman shared with me that she, as a child, wasn't allowed to spend any time in her front yard or outside of her house by herself because her mother was so scared that something would happen to her in the front yard of her own home. She didn't allow her children to spend any time in the front yard by themselves because it's such an ongoing issue. And really, while I was there, you could really feel the sense of hopelessness and abandonment that the people of Wilcannia and Broken Hill feel from the government. So one man said to me, it's like they come in, they throw a bit of money at us, and then they leave. They don't really put any effort into understanding the real issues or working alongside the community is really what I got from the people of Wilcannia and Broken Hill. So I would say that the government is letting women and children down who experience domestic violence in remote areas because they can't possibly understand the complex issues that women experience when they're in such a remote and isolated location. And for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, the impacts of intergenerational trauma, the connection to land and to culture that they have to their country is something that we as white people, I don't think, can possibly imagine. So I think the government needs to acknowledge all of these issues and go in and do more work to work with women and children escaping or on their journey away from domestic violence.